Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Jordan and today I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I've read in 2020. All 12 of them. Yeah, it was a bad year for me. And for, I would venture to say, most people. So I didn't read as much as I normally do. However, I did have a good reading year in the sense that the books that I read, by and large, were quite good. So this might actually not be as juicy as like previous years because I didn't read books like After or Zenith or 36 Questions That Changed My Mind About You. There was a lot of like really solid books, and so we're going to talk about that today. And to kick it off, for the worst book that I read in 2020, I honestly struggled with this one between two books because one of them I like didn't love while I was reading it, but then kind of has aged a little bit better in my head, whereas the other one I didn't mind it so much while I was reading it and has aged horribly in my head, so I really struggled, but I think I'm gonna go with the one that I enjoyed less while reading it, and that would have to be Into the Drowning Deep by Mira Grant, and that was a Papercut book club read. I, however, was at a cabin when we were supposed to do the discussion, and so I didn't actually get to discuss the book during the live stream. I'm in there for like 2 seconds, I'm like, hi guys, and then I freeze. So I will link the Papercut book club discussion below, however, I'm not really in it. So I'm gonna tell you my thoughts now. Into the Drowning Deep is a kind of thriller horror book about a crew of scientists and miscellaneous other people who discover killer mermaids, and they're basically trying to find these killer mermaids that attacked a ship about a year prior. And we follow like a whole cast of characters. There's like kind of a main protagonist, but oh my gosh, I forgot her name. But anyway, but it's not just the protagonist, it's like most of the crew. There's a lot of different characters that we follow, and I think that's one of the biggest detriments to this book because none of the characters feel properly developed. Not a single one. There was not one character where I was like, yes. And for me, I'm a huge character reader, so I just didn't think it worked. There's two reasons. One, the characters, none of them were engaging, and for a thriller slash horror, you really want to like care for the characters because then the deaths have more stakes, because I didn't care for any of them. So when several of them died, I was like, cool, I don't care. And that was a huge issue. The second issue that I had with the book was in monster stories, which this was a monster story, I definitely prefer seeing less of the monster. I prefer the Jaws approach, where it's more about the suspense than actually the monster itself, because my imagination is always worse than the actual monster doing the actual monster things. So I thought that they kind of jumped the gun a little bit with when the monsters were introduced and that there was just too much of it, and it kind of honestly ruined the suspense for me, which already wasn't very high because I didn't like any of the characters. What I will say was good about the book was that it's fairly memorable. I do remember most of it, so that I will give it credit for, because the next book that I'm going to talk about, barely remember a thing. And I read the other one more recently. And then the other thing that I'm going to mention that it did well is I think it integrated the scientific elements, because primarily the crew are scientists, and I thought that the scientific elements were really well integrated into the story and the plot without being too dry or overbearing. I thought it was a really good balance between the scientific elements, which you could tell were very well researched, and the kind of plot and character, well, not the character elements, but the plot elements. I thought there was a good balance of those things where it didn't feel like it was too much, but it definitely felt like the characters were believable in their roles as scientists and that the author had done their proper due diligence in their research. Moving on, the second worst book that I read last year was another Papercut book club read. This one I actually was a part of the discussion, and I probably enjoyed it the most out of everyone there. So I was kind of put in a place of like defense of like, this element wasn't so bad, this element was okay. But as I mentioned, this book aged like milk in the sun. I, A, don't remember pretty much anything that happens in this book, and B, just like the elements that I do remember, I don't like anymore, you know? So while I definitely in the live stream was forced into a position of being like, yeah, it's not so bad, there's okay elements, I feel like it did not age well in the brain, you know? So I'll discuss it a little bit, but basically this is the spin-off series of The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. It's like a prequel to those books that follows President Snow as a teenage guy. I was like, this is an interesting premise. I'm okay with it. I know a lot of people were pissed, but I was like, I'm intrigued more than anything. And I started reading it. I was like, this isn't so bad. This isn't so bad at all. However, we get to about the halfway point, and this is not like a big spoiler, but President Snow gets sent to one of the districts, and that's where I was like, oof, this book took a turn for the worse. I was much more interested in like the social politics while he was in the capital, but then the moment he got sent to the districts, I was like, this story just went like so far off the rails. On top of that, there was very few characters that I was interested in. I don't think the overall character arc worked. And as I mentioned, like I don't remember. I remember like maybe 3 things that happened in this book. And like logically, I'm like, it's probably better to like a book a little bit than like hate a book. But the books that I hate, at least they're like seared into my brain, you know? And then it doesn't feel like a waste of time. Whereas this book, gone from memory, you know? It was not great and I would not recommend. Was it the worst thing I've ever read? No, but again, not great. The next book that I'm going to talk about, which was the 3rd worst book that I read in 2020, was Love Is Not Enough by Mark Manson. This was like my first foray into self-help books. It's by the same author who did The Subtle Art of Not Giving an F. And basically, I was in a bad place because I had just gotten my feelings hurt by a boy, and I saw that title and I was like, yeah baby, love is not enough. Boys are stupid. Dunk on love, because I was in a bad place. It was not very good. It's basically like an Audible exclusive, I think, or audiobook exclusive at least. So it's in this weird kind of like almost podcast format where basically Mark Manson interviews a bunch of people about their love lives and tries to like kind of coach them, but he's not like a therapist, so he's just like a third-party observer that's like, you should probably not do that. But the people that he selected had like these kind of, for the most part, very out there or specific issues with their romantic lives. Like there's a lot of niche things that I'm like, how applicable is this to like most people, you know? It felt like it was more of a therapy session by a not therapist that was like specific to a single person rather than something that's like widely applicable. And so overall, I didn't find it very helpful. Some of it was like engaging, at least. There was like a couple people where I was like, yeah, I want to figure out how this, you know, how this progresses, how you move forward in your love life. But most of it honestly was pretty boring. And while most of the people found it useful, I feel like the changes were not very significant because it was only 3 or 4 times that Mark Manson talked to them. So it wasn't like they had that much time to like completely change the way that they approached their romantic lives. I don't know. It was just not a very helpful self-help book structured in a very bizarre way. So overall, not a huge success. Okay, so next up, and I'll be honest, I probably liked this one a little too much. We have The Host by Stephanie Meyer. Listen, I understand that this book is problematic on many fronts. Many fronts. However, I was in the exact headspace that I needed to be in to enjoy this book. And I am gonna be honest, Stephanie Meyer knows how to write an entertaining read. I'll give it to her. So this book basically is about, I guess, the last humans after like an alien invasion, but the aliens are not like physical beings. They just inhabit the bodies of humans. That's how they like expand, is they basically wander from planet to planet that they have like captured, and they used the bodies beings that are there as hosts. Like, it still looks like society, but they're like these peaceful aliens that live in this utopic world. However, the humans, they're just basically little body sacks for the aliens to take over, so they get their lives stripped away from them, which is not cool. But I think there's a lot of interesting questions that it posed in regards to the character inhabiting this body and what that means for the person inside of it, what that means for the alien who can't live outside of a body. And so there's like the two consciousnesses that both need this physical form. And so that, I don't know. Or surrounding that, I thought there was some interesting questions posed. Did Stephanie Meyer answer those questions in an insightful way? No. But I had fun, and that, you know what? Give it to me. Let me have it. I will add though, Stephanie Meyer has a little problem with age gaps. Why does she do that? Why does she enjoy writing problematic age gaps so much? Stephanie, my girl, there is nothing that's okay about your age gaps. In Twilight, you get away with it because this, you know, a 150-year-old vampire is in the body of a 17-year-old, so it's like less weird. And the Jacob baby thing is not great, but it's like you write it off as like, it's platonic until it's not, but it's platonic for now. It's still not good, but I'll let you have it. But this book, girly, like, the ending has a nasty, disgusting, illegal relationship. That's just not okay. It's just, I'm gonna say it right here, right now. It is not good, and there was no reason for that, Stephanie. There was absolutely no reason for that. It is not a cute look on you. So we'll end it there. Next up, we have another Papercut read, and this was Pretty Girls by Karen Slaughter. And I hadn't really read a book in this realm, which is kind of mystery, horror, thriller-esque. It's basically about two adult sisters who have been estranged that come together to try to investigate what happened to their other sister who they believe was murdered like many years ago. She basically went missing and they believe her to be murdered. So basically they are trying to figure out what happened to her. I'm not super into this genre, so I feel like maybe it was derivative, but to me it wasn't because I'm not super versed in the tropes. So bear that in mind. If you are really into like the kind of horror, thriller, mystery stuff, maybe this wouldn't be as much for you, but I genuinely really enjoyed it. Now I do want to add that I'm going to throw out like pretty much every trigger warning possible for this book. I would look it up if you're like considering reading it, because I do think it's a pretty good read, but there's a lot of like really dark stuff that happens, so I would bear that in mind, and if there is anything that you're like concerned about triggering you, I would look into it prior to reading this book. One of the elements that I really liked was the sister relationship. I thought that was kind of the main interesting part of this book. It's what really grounded it, and I thought that a lot of those dynamics were explored in a really interesting way. I am a sucker for sister relationships, and I thought that it was really well done in this book. I will say there was some pacing issues, and it wasn't so much like a bunch of twists and surprises as just like a descent into a darker and darker place. So that's also something to bear in mind. It doesn't necessarily surprise you with like in a clever way of like, oh, didn't see that one coming. It's just like, I didn't see that coming because I didn't think you would go that far. So that's another thing to bear in mind. Also worth mentioning that there's just some like casual racism that was never addressed. And overall it wasn't like the most memorable book. So that's kind of all I have to say. If you want to hear my more in-depth thoughts, I will link the Papercut live stream for this below as well. So now we're getting into the books that I like really enjoyed. And the next book that I'm going to talk about is The Diviners by Libra Bray. And this was another Papercut book club book. And I listened to the audiobook. Oh my. This was probably the best audiobook I've ever listened to. The voice actor who did this was so good at creating personas and character voices and was just really engaging in the read of the text. And like usually I can't get into it as much as if I was like reading it with my eyes. But honestly, the narrator did such a phenomenal job that I think I probably enjoyed it more as an audiobook than if I had read it physically. So just, you know, hats off to that. Overall, I thought this was like a really fun kind of darker urban fantasy that includes a lot of really cool kind of occult things. The characters were really interesting, and I think that was another thing that really impressed me about this book, was the way that the author was able to quickly characterize so many characters, because it is a huge cast. Basically, it's set in the 1920s and a bunch of occult things are happening in New York, and I'm not going to go too much more in depth than that. If you want the full spoilery thoughts, I'm going to link the Papercut discussion below. But I thought the author did a phenomenal job of creating voices for these characters, even though we don't get, you know, super in-depth into all of them because it's, you know, a huge cast and one book. I think the author did a phenomenal job of characterizing the characters in memorable ways so that even if they don't have like full arcs in this book, because it is part of a larger series, they still feel like they're very real and rich and, you know, have things going on in their lives. And I really appreciate that in a first book of a series, because that can be hard to do and balance well with the, you know, main characters and the plot elements and the world elements. It's a lot to establish, and that's one thing that I really will praise this book for. I did pick up the sequel as well on audiobook, so I'm going to be reading that this year, and I'm excited to see where this series goes because I feel like I've heard good things. Next up, we have Princess Academy by Shannon Hale. This was one of the last books that I read last year, and it was a reread, but I hadn't read it since I was a child. It was really good. It wasn't as good as The Goose Girl in my humble opinion, but it was a really enjoyable read. It's the same sort of light fantasy that The Goose Girl is, and it follows Mary, who is a girl who lives on a mountain, and basically the prince of the kingdom that they are a part of has come of age, and the priests have said that Mount Eskel, which is their mountain, is where he will find his future bride. And so all of the eligible bachelorettes on the mountain are sent to a princess academy to learn how to become a princess, and at the end he chooses the woman that he wants to be his bride. So it's about their time at this school, and I'm not going to go like more in depth than that into the summary because I honestly think it's a really fun and sweet read. It's not very challenging, but I definitely recommend this to younger readers and also people who are interested in like a nice light read that has some really great characters and some really nice themes and messages as well. It's definitely an easy, quick one that is just very pleasant. Next up, we have another reread, and that is Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. I've talked about this book a few times on my channel, so I'm not going to go into it too much. Basically, I was looking for a comfort read, and this book I had read in 2019 very much enjoyed, so I was like, you know what, baby, we're doing it again, round two. I'm gonna link my video talking about this book in the description down below, but basically it's this fictional world where instead of Trump, we got a lovely progressive liberal woman president whose son Alex has a rivalry of sorts with the Prince of England, but then they fall in love, and it's just charming. It's a lovely book. I'm gonna link my thoughts below. Next up, we have Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. This was one of the first books that I had read in 2020, and it was such a lovely read. Basically, if you don't know, this book follows four sisters during the American Civil War, I believe. And basically it's about their life and their family and their relationships and their dynamics, and I think there was a lot of really sweet, charming things about this book. The characters are so lovely. It's written in a really beautiful way. There was really not much that I didn't like about this book. Obviously there's a few morals and things that are a bit outdated, but overall, even then, like, I thought a lot of the kind of morals about, you know, relationships. There's a lot of things about like just being a good partner and being, you know, a good sister that were true to this day. I thought it was really sweet. I like the movies. I'd seen both the 90s movie and the Greta Gerwig film prior to reading this book, so there wasn't a lot that like surprised me per se, but it was just a really charming story about these four sisters, and as I mentioned, I love books about sister relationships and like family dynamics, so this one was truly a winner. Could not recommend it enough. Okay, following that up, we had another Papercut book, and then its sequel, and I honestly don't know which one I like more now, because on the first time reading it I enjoyed the second one more, but on the second time reading it I'm not sure that I do. They're very close, but I'm probably gonna still order it as third best book and second best book of 2020. Nevernight and God's Grave. I really enjoy the series. That is not a surprise for those of you who are familiar with my channel, but my enjoyment of them did slightly shift on the reread of these books. I did do a Papercut live stream on my channel for Nevernight, so I will link that down below. And basically this series follows Mia Corvier, who is a young woman that is training to become an assassin at an assassin school, and then, you know, later on does some assassinationing. Assassinates folks. There's a lot of bloodshed in this book. One thing that I really love about the series is the world and the atmosphere of these books. There is something that's very unique to this series that I can't really like put a name on, but the world building is so phenomenal and it just feels incredibly unique. I think there are a few issues with character and pacing in both of the books. However, overall I think the author does a phenomenal job of setting up this really unique world with an interesting plot that is full of surprises and some really strong characters. The magic system is also really cool, and I think that it's definitely a fun, engaging read. That being said, the third book is not up here, even though I did start it. I haven't like properly DNF'd it. I just picked it up, started reading it, and haven't finished it. I intend to, but it's not as good so far. I'm about halfway through. I've been about halfway through for like 8 months now. And yeah, it's just not as good. I will finish it. I promise I will finish it. I will get to it. I will give my thoughts. But it's not great. And finally, the best book of 2020, in my humble opinion, that I read was The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. Wow, oh wow. This is the second Taylor Jenkins Reid book that I have read. I started with Daisy Jones and the Six, which I also really enjoyed, but this book is something special. My girl Evelyn Hugo is such a phenomenal character, and this book does a phenomenal job of exploring her life. Basically, Evelyn Hugo is a movie star in Hollywood in the 60s, 70s, 80s even, but primarily I think it takes place in like the 60s and early 70s, and also in the present day in New York. She has finally decided to tell her life story and all of the tea about her 7 husbands. That's right, baby girl, this woman was married 7 times, and so she's telling her life to a reporter, and that's kind of like the framing device of the book. But in the present day, it follows the reporter rather than Evelyn, which is really interesting because there's a lot of like mystery to that. So that's like a nice little through line for the book. And then of course also the 7 husbands. You're constantly wondering like who the next one is going to be and what were the circumstances that led her there. She's just a phenomenally interesting character, and I think both her arc and the characters that are like immediately surrounding her, they all have so much depth. They all have such an interesting journey, and it's honestly one of the most interesting female leads I have ever read. I could not recommend this book enough. I think the author also did a phenomenal job of creating the atmosphere of Hollywood in the 60s, which was a very interesting kind of transitional period between the Hollywood studio system and like the classical era of Hollywood to a more experimental era in the late 60s, early 70s when the system fell apart. There was like a lot of really cool independent films that were made then, and I think the author did a pretty good job of exploring that, though of course as a film student I was like, go further girl, like get in there, talk about that shit. So that's me being biased. As a film student, I would have loved to have seen a little bit more of those changes. However, I think regardless, she did a really good job of setting that up. And for most people who are not film students and don't know a lot about film history, I think it does a really good job of painting a picture of that era and of the star system and a lot of really interesting stuff that was going on in Hollywood. So I could not recommend this book enough. I honestly think anyone would enjoy this book. That may be bold of me to say, but even if you don't love it as much as I do, I think anyone could pick this up and walk away being like, yeah, that was a good use of my time, you know? So I recommend the heck out of this book. But that is all. That is it. Those are the books that I read in 2020, and I will link all of the relevant videos for the books that I had already talked about in the description box down below if you want to hear my thoughts a little bit more in depth. I'm really hoping that this year I can read a little bit more quantity while keeping up the quality of the books that I am reading. So, you know, stay tuned, because apparently I'm back on BookTube, baby. I don't know how I ended up back here after being like, yeah, I'm done with this, but here we are. So expect a few more reviews coming your way. If you have read any of these books and have thoughts, I would love to hear them down below. But that is it, and I will see you next time. Bye!